Building a bookcase is one of the great ways to get into learning handwork. It's a very basic project and can be completed in only a couple days, completely with hand tools. But the question is, what kind of bookcase should you build? Now, I have real strong opinions about bookcases. I have a lot of books, I write books, and I build bookcases. And so I don't think your bookcase should look like the kind of commercial stuff you'll see at the store. I think those commercial bookcases are pretty ill-conceived. So let's talk about this bookcase and what makes it different than the stuff that you might buy at a store. Number one, you might notice that there are no adjustable shelf pins on the sides. These shelves are fixed, and that's for a very good reason, and that reason is strength. When you have adjustable shelves that move up and down, you have some adjustability, which is great, but what you're giving up is strength. So if you have a shelf that can move up and down, then you don't have a shelf that can prevent the case from racking back and forth. This shelf is not only nailed in through the sides, it's also nailed in through the back. And that gives this shelf a lot of strength. It can hold a ton of books. Whereas in a commercial bookcase, because it's not nailed at the back, this can sag very easily. So we have fixed shelves that allow us to use less material, less time in building it, and also makes for a smarter bookcase. And a smart bookcase is where you load the heavy stuff down here at the bottom, and then the lighter stuff as you move up. You don't end up overloading the top with some crazy adjustable, shelf that shouldn't be there, and then the case doesn't fall over and crush a small animal. So we have this fixed case, it's strong, less material, but the question becomes, well, if we're going to fix these shelves, where should they be? And the answer is a lot of calculating, looking at a lot of history about the sizes of books, and here's what we have here. So big books, really big books, are going to be about 11 by 17. And those aren't as common today, but they do show up, especially if you like art books or books on old tools. They usually are in these oversized folios. So this is 18 inches, and that will force you to put the big heavy books down here, which is where they should be. The next size, this space right here, is 12 inches. And this will hold the very standard folio that became popular in the 20th century, which is 8.5 by 11. So you can get all your sort of standard woodworking books in this that you'll find at the store. And then the top is 9 3/8. And there's not a top on this, so you can actually put some taller books up here as well. But 9 3/8 holds all the paperbacks, all the 6 by 9, 6 inches by 9 inches format that are also very common. And it also reduces the amount of material you need because you're not going to put a top on it. And if you don't have a top on it, you're not going to stack crap on top of it. So it's a pretty smart design, I think. But then the other question is, well, how are we going to build it? And we're going to do it entirely by hand, and I'm going to walk you through some of the joints that we're going to use here and the things we're going to discuss on the DVD. Number one is the case is going to be put together with dados. So we're going to cut these dados with a saw and remove the waste with a chisel and a router plane. Then the shelves are secured not only in the dado with hide glue, but they also have forged nails all along the side. So we're going to learn about how to pick the right nail and how to apply it without splitting the work and to make it so that this case will stay together long after you're dead. So we've got forged nails all along the sides. Also, we've got forged nails that hold on the back. Down here at the base, we have a kick, very traditional kind of 4-inch kick, which also acts to strengthen this shelf. That's simply glued in and nailed with the forged nails. Back here, we have a top rail that is inserted into grooves. So we're going to learn how to cut stopped grooves in the sides that'll hold this top rail in, which is also secured with forged nails. And then we have a tongue and groove beaded back. So these are multiple thin boards It's not just one piece of plywood, we're going to do it right. So it's multiple thin boards that have a tongue and groove, cut with a tongue and groove plane. And then we have a small bead. So if you look down here, you'll see this little bead. And so we're going to learn to use beading planes. And this bead will hide any contraction or expansion. And so it'll hide an ugly gap that occurs over the course of over the year. And then lastly, we're going to maybe put some paint on it. So we'll talk a little bit about milk paint, and I put a splash of color on this just to give it more of a contemporary look. And so that's the bookcase. This thing took me about 2 days to build from start to finish in my shop at home, entirely by hand. If it takes you a little bit longer, that's okay. But we're going to get started by cutting the sides to size, shooting the ends, and then getting right into the dados. Now you can start with rough stock from the sawmill if you want to build this bookcase, but that's not what most hand tool woodworkers did for the last 500 years. They went to the mill and they picked up stock that had already been dressed at the sawmill and perhaps at the planing mill, which is what we have here. So really the modern hand tool solution to prepping stock is to pay somebody to do it for you. My local lumberyard will do it for an extra 20 cents a board foot. It comes nicely jointed and planed and ready for me to work. This saves me about 2 days of backbreaking work with a jack plane. So don't feel like you're cheating if you go to the sawmill and you ask them to dress the stock for you, because that's what's been done for centuries. Now when you get the stock, even from the mill, even if it's been planed, it might have some roughness on it. It's certainly not going to be, you can't count on it to be square on the ends. And so the first thing we're going to do is we're going to knock down this case side to its finished length. We're going to do that with saw benches, which are little knee-high platforms. If you don't have saw benches, you don't have to make them. Go and buy some 5-gallon buckets at the store. That'll work just as well. And then we're going to use a hand saw. You can, this is an old one, or you can buy a nice one at the home center for 10 bucks, one of the sharp tooth ones. And then I just have, this is just a wooden square that I made. So we're going to square this one edge first, and just with a pencil line. And if you're new to sawing, it's always good to also mark it through the thickness. So I've marked it on the face and down through the thickness, and that will help you keep your cut square. You don't have to clamp anything when you use saw benches. You've got one knee that holds the work down against the saw bench, and then this knee restrains the work from skittering off the saw bench. So hold the saw with a gentle grip with your index finger extended out. It's not supposed to be like this. You'll saw straighter if you do this. And then start the saw really low. I'm at like a 10 or 15 degree angle here, and I'm just going to pull back a couple times and then let the saw fall, and I'm watching it go through the thickness first. So that's where I'm paying attention. At first, if you find you're going offline, the best way to fix that is to not tweak the saw left or right like that. The best way to fix it is to lower the saw. So I'm going to drop the saw down so that the blade goes into the part of the kerf that is correct, and that will help me correct the cut. And then when I'm back online, I can go back to a 45 degree angle and pick up speed. And then at the end, I want to prevent it from splintering, so I just reach around and make that cut very gently. So this is fairly square, but it's still pretty rough, even though I'm using a nice, fine-tooth saw. So the next thing we have to do is we have to shoot the end with a plane and a shooting board, and we'll do that at the bench. One of the foundational tools in handwork is the shooting board. This allows you to square and true up and clean up all your sawn edges, and it is superior in many ways to electrical equipment, electrical saws and such, because it allows you to adjust the length of your pieces in tiny, tiny increments, like 1/1000th of an inch. So it's a really smart thing that you just make yourself. You don't have to buy one. As you can see, this is a beautiful, beautiful piece of work, just nailed together out of, just junk. All that really matters is that I have a fence that is 90 degrees to this little track that I have, and that is essentially all it has to be. It can be any size, small, little, whatever you like. I'm using a shooting plane. This is a pretty expensive piece of kit. You don't have to have an expensive plane to do this kind of work. For years, I just used the heaviest plane that I had, and that will work just fine. But this one is really nice because it has a nice square edge, and so I have it all fenced in here, but you don't have to have that. So what we're going to do is I'm going to push this plane forward, and it's going to clean off this edge. But the problem is that I'm planing across the grain. And so when you plane across the grain like this, you can get splintering on this far side. We call it spelching. That's the proper word. So we need to do something to prepare this edge so that it won't spelch on us. Otherwise, we're going to have to clean off our true edge again. So one way of doing it, and there are a dozen ways, but one way of doing it is to just take a chisel and we just come down and we bevel off that corner to protect it. So now we can see that instead of just a straight corner there, we have a bevel, and that will prevent the spelching. So now we put this up against the plane. And you can hear I'm taking a heavier cut here and not here. So I'm listening as much as watching. So now that I can hear that I'm taking a full cut all along the edge, I can pull it back. And now I can see that this is ready for finish. And that's how easy a shooting plane is it squares, it prepares for finishing, and it only takes a few strokes. So after we true up all the edges for both of these side pieces, then we can move on to putting on our marriage mark that will guide us as we put these sides together and start in on the dadoing. I have my two side pieces prepped here, and I need to make a mark on them, a very special mark, before I can cut the dados. And this one mark will help me keep the pieces oriented throughout the construction process so I don't end up putting the dados on the wrong side or assembling the case upside down or backwards or doing something horrible. And you don't need to invent your own system. I know a lot of woodworkers will come over here and they'll put they'll write front, they'll write back, AA, BB, CC, Q, put a compass rose on it. All those are unnecessary. What you really need to do is just put what we call the marriage mark. And a marriage mark looks like this. So it's just a pencil line, and it's put on the top edge of a construction, and it's a triangle with some little doodads here at the bottom. And what this one mark does, and this is the only mark I'm going to put on these sides, but this mark can tell me instantly what is the front of the case, that the base of the triangle faces the back, that when I take them apart, I can see very readily what is the right and what is the left. And if these parts get separated during the construction process, I or anyone else in the shop can immediately interpret those marks and know that these two go together, and that this is how they go together, and that the joints go on the inside, and this is an outside surface. So with a marriage mark on here, let's take a look at one other little design detail. And this is more important with handwork in a lot of ways than it is with machine work. And that is that I have oriented these boards so that the heart side is facing out on the case. And the bark side, what was the bark of the tree, is facing the inside of the case. And that's very intentional. We try to put the heart side on the outside of a case because when these boards take on moisture, is that if they are going to cup, then they will cup in a way that the cupping will be on the bark side. And what that means is imagine that this would actually turn into an upside down frowny face. kind of when it cups. And if this turns to an upside down frowny face, then what will happen is it will actually tighten the joints at the dados. If it cupped the other way, so that this was a smiley face, then it would open the joints on our dados. And so that would be a bad thing. So we've got these so that the heart side is facing out, so that we'll keep our joints tight over time. And there's one other little detail. When you design any piece of casework in Western culture, is that you pay attention to the cathedrals on the sides, on the outside, whether it's a door panel or whether it's a case side. And you try, in general, to try to keep it so that the cathedrals are pointing up to the sky. And this one, it's very obvious right here that it's pointing up, and it's obvious it's pointing up. We've got a little bit of what we call a cat's face down here. So that is pointing up, and we look at the other face, and we can see that it's pretty dominant. You know, there's a little bit pointing down, but this is probably the best orientation for these. So that's all you need to do to mark, is we put the marriage mark on there. I've got my heart sides facing out. I've got my cathedrals pointing up. So I'm going to open these up. And I know from my marriage mark that these are the inside surfaces. So this is where I'm going to lay out my dados. So let's take a look at the rough dado layout here. So I have the two pieces together, the marriage mark pointing to the front, and we can see that I have roughly laid in where the dados are going to be. Now, exactly where the dados are going to be is going to be more determined by the stock and its thickness, and we'll get to that in a little bit. But you want to lay in these rough positions so that you don't make a mistake, so that you don't cut one dado on this side of the line and the other one on this side of the line, and then your shelves will just be all cockeyed. So make this layout and in pencil. And so this bottom, this is the bottom of the case. This is 4.5 inches up from the bottom. This is where the kick is going to go. And you don't have to write down all these dimensions. Everything is going to be included with this video, including a chapter that covers all these steps. But this is 4.5. This is approximately 3/4 of an inch for the shelf, as are each of these dados. Here is our 18 inches for the big books, 12 inches for the medium books, and 9 3/8 for the little books. So I just penciled those in, made sure that they lined up on both of them. So this is sort of a visual confirmation that I'm not going to make a mistake. And then I'm going to put these back together, check my marriage mark, so that's good. And the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to pull the dados from the faces and then pull them around the edges so I know when to stop dadoing. So what I've done here, as you can see, is I've done that on this edge. And what I've done is I brought these down in pencil, and then I took a cutting gauge, a very simple, just you can use a marking gauge, a cutting gauge, whatever you have. And what I did then is I set that to 1/4 inch. And the 1/4 inch is the depth of our dado. So I simply took that and went in here and marked the bottom of that. It makes a knife line with this little cutter, and then I filled it in with pencil so that I could see it better, and so that you could see it better. And then finally, I took my square and brought these lines down, and even though I had them in pencil, I went in and scored them with a knife, just to score the fibers a little bit, so that when we plane this stuff out with a router plane, it doesn't spelch on us. So it's just severing the fibers a little bit with a knife. And that completes the dado layout, but let me show you how we actually do that here on one side. I'll do one so that you can see how it works. So I've done this. I have the dados pulled down on one. And so what I'm going to do is I first take my knife and I'm going to drop it into the knife line from my first dado and stab in, and that transfers the mark over to the other side. And this way I'm not measuring and I'm much less likely to make a mistake. So I'm just going to do that on all of them. I don't want the boards to shift at all, otherwise, you know, I could get the dados in different places. So I'm just going to pull that mark over, which is good. And so I can put this one aside for now. Then I'm going to take my square and roughly bring this down. So I take my square, bring it up to my knife line, and then put a pencil line down there, just like that. And then I'll take my cutting gauge, and I will join the two spaces that I just brought down. And put a little lead in there so I can see it. And then I'm going to score the fibers with the knife. And the way I do that is I take my knife and I feel until it drops into the knife line that I scored when I transferred it over. Then I slide my square up to the knife and just bring it down until I can feel it drop into the knife line left by the cutting gauge. So bring the knife along the edge. It'll fall right into your little nick. Slide your square over to it, and then just pull the knife line down. So we'll repeat that here, and then we'll be ready to saw the walls of the dado and remove most of the waste with a chisel. So now we're set up to saw the walls of the dado, and I'm using a fence here. So this is just a block of junk, you know, that just happens to have a square corner on it. You can use dimensional lumber, it doesn't matter, but just something that you can manage to clamp to your bench. And so this is going to be a fence for the saw plate so that we can saw down to that 1/4 inch mark that I've marked here and here, and we'll know when to stop sawing, because that's also very important. And we're going to have a little pusher block here that will help push the plate against the fence. Now, when you get good at this, you probably won't need a fence, and you'll just work right to the line. But if this is your first dado, you're going to have much more success getting the saw curve perfectly vertical if you use this little fence. And so after I do that, after I saw out then we're going to mark the other wall of the dado. So let's start here. What I've done is, the other thing you might notice is I have positioned this fence directly on top of the pencil line. So we want to remember that if you start by covering the pencil line, that you'll cover the pencil line on all the other dados, and that will keep them all perfectly in line. The last thing to keep in mind is that the front of the case is pointing toward me. It should point toward you. The reason being is that I can very readily see where to stop here. Now you can see where to stop back here, but this cut doesn't matter so much. If I overcut and go beyond this line here at the back, it's not going to show because it's at the back of the case. But if I make a mistake and overcut here, then everybody's going to know that I'm a bad sawyer. So once again, we'll take your saw and just gently move it back and forth. And this pusher block really helps. This is not my invention. This is something I found in an old British woodworking magazine in the middle of the 20th century. So I have hit my line here. That's all it took back there. But as you can see, I have not hit my line up at the back of the case. And so I'm going to lift up the handle a little bit. And let's see, a little bit more to go. And just take your time with it. All right, that looks good. And then I always saw out the middle just a little bit. It won't affect the strength of the joint, but it will make it easier to clean. The next thing to do is to show the shelf to this joint so that we can mark the opposite wall of the dado. We have a rough pencil line here, so I know which side of the line to cut on, but that is not the exact thickness of my shelves. My shelves might be 3/4, they might be 13/16. It doesn't really matter in handwork. What matters is you join one piece to another piece. So I know from my triangle here and the orientation that this is the top shelf. And we know that the case front is facing toward me. So I have the shelves laid out here on the bench. And as you can see, of the 3 shelves, we have another marriage mark. And this is on the front edge of the 3 shelves. And as you can see, the marriage mark has been turned 90 degrees from what we had before. It was facing on the sides, it was facing the end grain here. But here we've rotated it 90 degrees. And so this is the top shelf, this is the middle shelf, this is the bottom shelf. And this is the only mark we need to know. So this is the top shelf. So we're going to take the top shelf, and I know that this is the front edge. So the front edge faces the front edge of this triangle. And now I press it up against the fence, and I can take a knife, and I can clamp it to my fence if I want to, but I don't have to. And then I just gently score this. Take your time. You don't want it to wander. And gently score the fibers. And I do it usually 2 or 3 times to make sure I have a knife line that I can see. So we'll do it one more time. And I can see that this stock is a little thinner than 3/4 because I have a little space between my rough layout line and my knife line. So it's a good thing that we did this, otherwise this shelf would rattle around in its dado like a loose tooth. So I'm going to return this to its pile. And now I can very readily see my knife line. So the next thing we have to do is we have to reposition this fence in the right place so that the dado will end up the correct dimension. And so that is what we're going to take a very close look at in the next bit. Hey, so if you look closely, you can see my knife line is right here next to the rough pencil line. And I put some pencil into the knife line so that you can see it a little better and so that I can see it a little better. And your first instinct might be to just take your fence, put it on your knife line, just like we did with the pencil line, and saw away. But if you do that, chances are your dado is going to be too loose. The problem is that saw teeth have set. So you can see the little teeth here. And what set is let's imagine that my fingers are the saw teeth in the saw plate. And what set is every other tooth is bent to the left and to the right. And this prevents the wood from sort of swelling up when you saw it and jamming the saw plate in the kerf. And so if you put your fence right on the line, it doesn't account for that bit of set, and we need to account for it. It's more complicated than, it sounds a lot more complicated than it is. All we're really going to do is we're going to see where the saw kerf should be here at the front, where it should be at the back, and then we can join those 2 lines. So I'm just going to nick inside these knife lines with the saw that I'm using to cut the dado. And this will take, by simply doing this, it will account for the set. So a little bit here, a little bit at the front. So now I can take this fence and I can lay it right next to the kerf and know that this will be exactly where the kerf needs to be. Now, if you're not sure, if you're unclear about whether it will be too loose or too tight, the best thing to do is to cheat a little bit so that the dado is a little too tight. And that way you can plane down the shelves a little later to fit. So don't go for too loose, always go for a little tighter in the end. So I'm going to clamp this down, and then I'm going to saw this wall, and then I'm going to do that for all the other 5 dados, and then we'll get to removing the waste with a chisel. All right, that's the last wall of the dado. So now we can get out the chisel and remove most of this waste. A common mistake that a lot of beginners make at this point is they take the router plane And they just, then they start to hog out the waste with the router plane. It seems like the right thing to do, but it's not. The router plane just isn't designed to take a really deep cut. I mean, you'll push it and it will jam in there. So really, the fastest way to go about it is to waste away most of this with a chisel. So you want to find a chisel that is about the same width as the dado, and maybe just a little bit less, not more. And you start with it bevel up. So I'm going to take away half this waste. So what that means is the dado is 1/4 inch deep. So I'm putting the knife, the tip of the chisel about 1/8 of an inch down. Bevel up until I can't go bevel up anymore because the chisel handle will ram into the case. So then, after I do that, come around to the other side, do the same thing. So here I am coming 1/8 of an inch down from the top, working bevel up, and removing as much as I can until the handle runs into the case. Then I'm going to switch to bevel down. So now I have the bevel down and the handle isn't in the way anymore. Then I repeat by trying to remove half of the waste that's left. So I have, what, 1/8 of an inch left, so I'm going to take a 1/16. Working bevel up. Again, I'm working from both sides this way so that I don't spelch by coming all the way through and splintering out either the front or the back. Now I could splinter out the back and it wouldn't matter, but just trying to be tidy, So we'll get in here and remove as much of the waste as we can bevel down. And I'm using the saw curves sort of as a depth gauge. When the saw curves disappear, I stop chiseling. And then I'm going to leave the last little bit of waste for the router plane to remove. A little bit here and a little bit here, and all this stuff in the middle. All right. So now, let's take the router plane and finish up this dado. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to set the depth stop. I want all these dados to be the same depth. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this and drop the knife in the router plane until it just hits the knife line here. And then I'm going to lock the depth stop. And then what I'm going to do is I'll check it over here just to make sure my dados are the same depth front and back. So that knife just goes right into that knife line. So now I know that that is at the correct depth. So my depth stop is locked. So I'm going to take just a little bit of cut first. Like I said, router planes only take a little bite. So I'm raising up the cutter a little bit and then thrusting forward. Also using the side of the cutter to clean the walls vertically. All right. So when the plane will not take a cut, then you can release the knob and you can lower the knife for the next cut until it hits the depth stop. This router plane's a really good tool even if you use some other way to make dados. Even if you're going to use a router or a table saw. If your stock is bowed, there are times when the router is not going to be the same depth all the way across. And so having a router plane, even if you're a total power tool guy, can make your dados all the same depth, which is a nice thing. So now I think that's going to go down and that hit the depth stop. So this should be the last pass. All right. I can get in there with a square and make sure the walls are square if need be. but usually the knife of the router plane, which is square, can give you that answer. So if the knife will go right up against the wall, then the wall is square, and you don't need to get in there with the square. So sometimes you can use the tools to give you your answer. So now we just have to do this to the other 5 dados, then we can start planing up the case and fitting the shelves. Now that we have all of the dados cut in both of the side pieces and they're all cleaned out and ready to go, they've gotten a little scuffed up from the handwork. And so this is the best time to go ahead and remove any of the milling marks that are left over from the machining or from doing it by hand, and also any of the scuff marks. I'm going to do it with a jointer plane because I want these surfaces to remain as true as I can. So the jointer plane's long sole is what ensures that the sides are flat. So the other thing you can learn about this that's important in handwork is, you know how we've been talking about the heart side and the bark side and how those curl. The heart side and the bark side is also really important when hand planing. And you always want to know where you are on the tree. And right now, I am on the bark side of the tree. Remember, the bark side was on the inside and the heart side was on the outside. If I know I'm on the bark side, I can look at these cathedrals and it can tell me which direction I should plane to plane with the grain. So if you can see here, this cathedral is pointing toward me. So when I'm on the bark side, I plane into the tips of the cathedral. And that is a better way of discerning the grain direction than any other method that I know. It's more right than any others. And then when we flip this over, you can see now I'm on the heart side, and the heart side I'm going to plane in the direction of the cathedrals. So instead of planing into the tips, I'm planing into the same direction that the cathedral is pointing. Now the way that I think of this, or when I teach it, what I try to tell people is, remember, if you're on the inside of the tree, if you're on the heart side, if you're on the inside of the tree, then your plane needs to go inside the cathedrals. So here I am on the inside of the tree, planing inside the cathedrals, overlapping my strokes. Oh, fouled the mouth there a little bit. That's what happens when you run over a shaving. And then it's always a good opportunity, especially with pine, which can get pitchy and build up on the sole, is to take a second to put some paraffin on the sole to help lubricate things. So, I was saying there, inside of the tree, inside the cathedrals. And when I'm on the bark side of the tree, and this is going to sound really stupid, but I'm going to tell you this anyway, is that I pretend that my plane, whatever it is like a little dog, and this sound is its barking noise coming out of its mouth as I go down the board. So that's the cathedral opening up. So it comes along and it's just like, ruff, 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 ruff. I told you it was stupid, but it works. So after I get that planed, I will probably dress one long edge. And I can do this in the face vise, but sometimes I don't have access to a face vise. And so there's nothing wrong with just standing it up on the bench and planing it true that way. It's actually quite easy. You don't need a lot of complicated bench equipment to do it. So we'll plane this long edge. Same, removing these marks from the sawmill. And once those are all removed, I can move on to cleaning up the other side. And once the other side is clean, then we can start planing up the shelves and fitting them into their dados. And now we're ready to attempt to fit the shelves. I haven't fit the shelves yet, so this could be a total fail. It's always fun to do it in front of a live audience. So what we're going to do here is we're going to surface the top edge of the top face of one of the shelves. So this is the bottom shelf, which is going to go in this dado right here. But what I'm going to do is I have to take off the machine marks anyway. So I'm not going to really fit it until I've at least done that. If it's too loose then, well, we'll have to come up with plan B. And plan B is usually assembling it and then wedging the underside of the dado, getting a very thin wedge in there to tighten up the joint. It works really well, and the nails will make sure that it holds, but it kind of looks bad. And being a woodworker, you naturally will show all your friends your mistake when that happens. And so we're going to try to get it right the first time. So now I'm just trying to take it easy with a smoothing plane here, removing just enough. I've got a little snipe left over from the machine planer here that has to go away. So that but I'm just trying to remove the minimum amount of material. I'm hoping it'll still be a little tight, and then I'll be able to plane the underside of the shelf. Now the underside of the shelf doesn't really matter. I mean, these are fixed shelves, so no one's going to turn them over, which is another advantage of having a fixed shelf. But this one in particular, I probably won't plane it at all unless I have to, unless it's way too fat, because this is going to face the floor and is going to be, covered by the kick on the front. So there's really no reason to plane the underside of the shelf. So almost got it there. There's still just a couple little areas I'm not happy about. The middle's always the hardest part to get to because there's cupping in the middle. All right, we'll give it a try. So I'm looking at my marriage mark on this side, so I know that the front of the case is facing me. So if we look at the marriage mark here, this should be facing me. So we get it in there, and it's going to be flush. So it's fitting down at the front. I could get it in with mallet pressure if I have to, but it's still tight at the back. So if we come around here, I can show you that. We're fitting nice and tight down here at the dado. But this is tight back here. So what do we do now? Well, we plane it away. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a mark on the face that I want to remove the material from. So let's take it off here. So I'm going to put some marks where it's not going in. So that way, if I get turned around when I take the board out of the case, I'll be okay. So just carefully pull this out. And then we can plane that section. A little too aggressive there. Now you notice I'm not planing back here because I don't know how those fit yet. So I don't want to take away any material that I don't have to. Chances are it also will be too tight, but we don't know. All right, so this is the bottom dado now, and so you shouldn't talk about having a total fail, because it'll happen. There we go. 1 down, 5 to go. So that's what we're going to do next, is plane up the next 5 shelves, fit them on this side, then take the shelves and fit them to the other side. And then we're just going to do a little cleanup, then we'll get the glue out. So now we're going to get started on the glue up. And if you were paying attention to what I was saying earlier, you're probably wondering, wait, He didn't put the grooves in for the back. We'll do that after assembly. You can just as easily do that after. You can do it now, whenever you like. I want to glue up. So I have things set up here on the bench. This is not exactly how I would do it at home. I'd probably do it on the floor, but I was trying to raise it up to make it easier so that you can see everything that's going on. But I have the shelves secured in hand screws upright, and as you can see, the triangles on the front edges all pointing up. This is the bottom, this is the front, and this triangle points right to you. So you're looking at the front of the case. The glue we're going to be using is one of my favorite glues. This is hide glue, liquid hide glue actually, and it's been around since the 30s. And there's so many reasons to use this glue for furniture. It's reversible. So if you do make a mistake, a little heat, a little water, a little moisture, and the joint comes apart. Now it's not going to come apart in the sun, or if you put a hot drink on it, it takes a lot more heat. But it is an excellent glue. It's been in use since the time of the Egyptians. Hide glue has. What I also really like about it for beginners is that it has a long open time, much longer than your yellow glue. So I might be able to have 45 minutes to get everything assembled by myself, and that means something when you're working alone. The other thing that is wonderful about hide glue is that it cleans up with water even after it's cured. So if you miss some thumbprints where you've gotten glue, then it's no big deal. I mean, a little warm water and the glue will dissolve and go away. And even if you don't catch it, unlike PVA, hide glue is transparent to most common traditional finishes like oil and varnish and such. So it's just really good stuff. Now it's a little cold in here, and so one of the disadvantages to hide glue, and there are a couple disadvantages which I'll cover, one of the disadvantages is that it gets a little solid. And so I have it soaking in some hot water. It'll soak for like 5 or 10 minutes, and then it'll be as viscous as your normal yellow glue. Real easy to work with. The other disadvantage to it is that it has a shelf life. Unlike polyvinyl yellow glue or white glue, is that this stuff only lasts about a year. On the back of it, no matter which brand you buy, there are several brands, no matter which brand you buy, you'll have a little date there on the back. And just check the date before you use it, and you have a year. Store it in the fridge or the freezer if you want to extend that. So we're going to use that, and what we're going to do first is we're going to do another trick that I learned from a glue technologist, and what we're going to do is we're going to size these joints. So this is end grain. And end grain doesn't have a lot of holding power when it comes to a joint like a dado. And in a lot of situations, people would say there's no holding power whatsoever, why even bother with the glue? Well, a friend of ours who is a technologist in glue, he said that, he has tested this, and I think he's completely right, is that you can get a lot of strength out of a joint like this with end grain if you first sort of clog the open pores of the end grain with glue. We call this sizing it, sizing the joint, glue size, which sizing can be used for a lot of different things, but in our case, we're going to be using it to create a stronger joint. Now, how it works is that the hide glue is going to get soaked into the open pores of the end grain, because wood is sort of like a bunch of soda straws, and then the glue will sort of start to set up just a little bit after a minute or so. And so if we put another layer, thin layer of glue on it, then that thin layer will not get pulled away from the surface because the pores will be clogged and the joint will have a lot more strength. Because the reason that end grain doesn't glue very well is because of those open pores sucking the glue away from the joint and starving it. So I don't know if you can see here, but this pine is thirsty as heck. So even after only about 30 seconds, this is all dry. It is just, it's not even wet. I mean, you can't even see that I put glue on it. This one is doing a little better. So good thing we did this, because otherwise this joint would not have been as good. Of course, we're going to nail the living heck out of it, so we're going to win anyway. But I'm going to put a little more glue on here. And this is only dry over here at this end. And this extra step really does help. Hide glue is not made from hooves, generally. It's not made from bones, though there is bone glue for different purposes. Hide glue is made from the trimmings, the stuff that you don't want to eat from a cow, like the cartilage in the nose and the connective tissue between the pieces. So it's, you can say it's environmentally pretty sound because it's using parts of the animal that normally would not get used for us. So, of course, if you're a vegetarian, there is not vegetarian hide glue. So, all right, so we've got that in, and I can see that it's not soaking in as much. So what we're going to do now is we're going to put some glue in the dados. Just do that right here. Now this is long grain, this is not end grain. So this does not soak up glue quite like the end grain does. So we don't have to size this part. If I wanted to get really finicky, I could also try to get glue on the end grain of these dados, but I'm not going to. I'm going to just live with this big part of the glue joint. One other advantage of hide glue that I love is that it doesn't have as much water in it as PVA. So you're much less likely to get joint lock, which is where the joint seizes up when you use it. The other thing I really like about it is it's a lubricant because it doesn't have as much moisture as a yellow glue, and so you won't get that joint lock. So I'm just going to get these in here. Never use your hand as a hammer. Never, never, never. All right. Come here. That one does not want to go in. And we'll knock things around here in a minute. Come on. There we go. Remember, kids, never use your hand as a hammer. All right, so I'm just going to take a mallet and knock these shelves forward. We're going to need a little more persuasion. That mallet's not quite small enough, big enough. There we go. That's good. Okay. Closing up nicely. And now we can flip it over and glue the other side. So that's pretty good. Might need to knock it around a little bit more, but I'm going to put some clamps on these joints and let it set up for half an hour, 45 minutes or something like that. And then we'll come back and we'll put the nails in and make it a permanent joint. Okay, so we put some clamps on it just to pull the joints up. One of the boards is a little bowed, and so getting the clamps on it gives me a chance for the glue to set up a little bit, and I'm doing a little cleanup here. Toothbrush, not the one you use for your teeth. Use your brother-in-law's toothbrush. Gets into these corners really nicely and gets the glue out of them. Though of course, because it's hide glue, you can take your time with this. You could even do it tomorrow, but I'll have the time to do it right now, so I'm going to do it. The other thing you're probably wondering is why I haven't checked this case for square. Why haven't I measured the diagonals and calculated the trig, the what of the trig. Answer is you don't have to at this point. This is a frameless cabinet, and it's probably out of square right now. And the back that we're going to put onto it is going to pull it square. So it's going to wiggle and wobble while it's like this, no matter what you do. So as long as the joints are tight and you're clamped square across, it's square enough to move on to the next step. So we're going to let this set up for a while. It really depends on the temperature and the humidity as to how long it could take. It could take an hour for the glue to set up. But after that, then we can take the clamps off and put some nails in. So. Let's get started on the back. The back are half-inch pieces, and you can join them in a variety of ways. Old bookcases, they would just be butted together like that. But during the dry season, these areas would shrink out, exposing your faulty workmanship. So don't do that. Other options are to cut a rabbet on the opposite faces of each corner and create a shiplap, which is what I've done on the case we were looking at before. But this time, we're going to do the king of the edge-to-edge joints, and that's going to be a tongue and groove. And we're going to use Stanley 49. This is a modern replica of the Stanley 49, which is a very cool tongue and groove plane. This plane cuts both the tongue and the groove. And the nifty thing about it is you just swing the fence and it cuts the other half of the joint. So we'll be cutting the tongue and the groove with this joint, and then we'll be taking a beading plane to create a decorative bead on the tongue side to further conceal the gap between the boards. So it looks like just one nice piece of beadboard, no matter what the season is. Before we can do that, we need to arrange the board so we know how they're going to be situated in the case and what gets a tongue and what gets a groove. So I'm going to arrange these as I want to see them. So if I'm looking at the front of the case, this is what I want to see. And I could pay attention to heart side and bark side, but really with this thin material, I'm much more concerned with appearance than I am with warping. Hopefully I'm going to nail these down firmly enough that there really won't be any cupping issues. But really I just want the back to look nice. So when it comes to heart side and bark side, appearance always trumps that. So this is where appearance is definitely trumping that. So I've got these laid out like I want to see them. I put some checks and stuff at the bottom. So now we're going to flip them over. So this is what the back will look like from the back. So this is what you won't see, because this will be against the wall. And this is where we're going to put our triangle to guide us. So we're going to draw a big cabinet maker's triangle here. And now we're going to mark it for the tonguing and the grooving so that I can know which edge needs a tongue and which edge needs a groove. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to put an X on these edges. These edges, long edges, get nothing. So I don't want to put an X there, don't do anything. So we're going to put a tongue on this one, matching groove here. A tongue here, a groove here, a tongue here, and a groove here. And that's all there is to the layout. If I just obey those, then the whole thing will go together quite nicely. It might be a little oversized at the end, and so we'll have to jack away some of the extra material on the edges, but pretty much the next step is to remove any machine marks on the face and then get out the tongue and groove plane. Now comes the fun part, the tongue and groove, and we're going to use this little tongue and groove plane. And it's really just clever as heck, invented about 100 years ago. And how it works is this fence is eccentric. So right now, with the fence set this way, we have one cutter exposed. And when one cutter is exposed, it cuts the groove. When we flip the fence around and secure it, now we can see we have two cutters exposed, and that cuts the tongue. And everything is perfectly lined up and flat, and you don't have to set anything. Nothing to set. So we have the first board here secured in the face vise, and as you can see, I have to put a tongue on this one. We've got a T, and what you want is you want the fence to ride against the surface that is facing the user of the bookcase. So this is the back that's facing the wall, and so this is the part that's facing the user, and so that's the surface that the fence rides on. And if you remember that, then you will be able to keep all of the joints in line all the way across. So we are cutting the tongue, so we need 2 cutters exposed. So we put it on the work. You don't have to start at the end. You can start anywhere. I like to start in the middle just because I have the entire fence in contact with the board, and it makes it easier to start. So what you don't do is you don't grab this knob. It looks so inviting. I mean, it says grab me right here, but you don't want to do that. If you grab this knob, chances are you're going to tilt the plane. And so whenever you use a fenced plane, instead what you want to do is you want to put your fingers on the fence like this. And so that presses the fence against the work. The next thing you're going to want to do is you're going to want to grab this tote. I mean, it's looking like, you know, it wants to be grabbed, just like a regular plane tote. When you're getting started with these tools, I don't recommend you do that either. What I recommend is that you just push with the back of your palm to keep everything straight. So this will prevent you from tilting the tool if you do these 2 things. And if you do that, if you put your fingers on the fence and you just push with this, then you won't break your tongue off. So it's much more like sawing than it is like planing. You're trying to stay in a line, trying to stay completely upright and not tilt the tool. If you tilt the tool, everything goes to heck. The whole thing breaks off. The other really clever thing about this tool is, you know, the question is, when do you stop? Well, as you can see, the plane stops taking a cut. And that's when you stop. When the plane stops cutting, the tongue is complete. So we've got one tongue there. So now, let's do a groove. So I've got the back of the case facing there. So I'm simply going to release the fence, turn it around, lock it, and now I've got one cutter exposed so I can cut the matching groove. Everything else is the same. The groove is actually the easier one to cut because, of course, you're only cutting half the material away. Other thing that's good to know is you're not going to get worn out if you avoid using your arms. As you can see, I'm rocking my body more than I am using my arms. And that's one of the tricks to planing. You need to plane all day. So just trying to make sure I got the last bit there at the bottom. All good. So let's see how I did. So here's our groove. Here's our tongue. They go together right nice, and they are perfectly in alignment here. Perfectly smooth, no difference between the two. So now we just have to cut the rest of the tongues and the grooves, and then we get to put the beading on the tongue side. Another fun part of the project. So now comes some more fun, and that is putting the bead on the tongue side of our joint. And we're going to use a beading plane to do that. Now you can make a scratch stock, you can use a router, but a beading plane is really fast. And the nice thing, compared to using an electric rotor, is it's not just the noise, but these produce a ready-to-finish joint, a ready-finish profile. So that you do it, you don't have to sand it, it's perfect. Well, some people don't sand it if it's made with a router, but that's their problem. So this little tool is what is called a molding plane, and they're still made today by a number of makers all over the world. There are instructions for making them yourselves, and they're everywhere on the secondary market. You can find these on eBay, you can find them anywhere. Beading planes were quite possibly the most common molding plane. Not very expensive. My first one was $20. So the way it works is it has a profiled sole and a profiled cutter that match. So they have to match to work. And so this profiled sole, as soon as the cutter makes a cut, the sole drops into it and keeps the cutter right where it needs to be to make the profile, so the profile doesn't wander all over the place. Very simple plane to use in just a few strokes. A couple things to remember about it is the way you hold it. When you hold it, you don't want to get the web of between your thumb and your forefinger wedged in back behind this iron, because it'll pinch and you'll get a blister really quickly. So the right place to hold it is back here with your dominant hand. With your offhand, this has a small fence, just like our tongue and groove plane. So we want to put our fingers on that fence and press the fence against the work. And then it also has a depth stop, so that when this area of the plane touches the work, the plane will stop cutting and your profile is complete. Very difficult to mess up. So normally I would put this bead on the tongue side so that I don't weaken the groove side. But in this case, the material is so thin and the fence is too tall that we have to put the bead on the groove side, which is what I'm going to do here. It's not ideal, but it is what it is. So, got the plane correctly oriented. And when it stops cutting, you're done. Do another one. And there you have it. Perfect little beads. And the back is complete and is ready to be nailed to the case. I love nails. There, I've said it. Nails to me are much like the hardware that you put on on any of your furniture, like your hinges, your knobs. I mean, you should be picky about the nails that you use. And as a result, these are not the nails that we are going to use. These nails are what we call wire nails, probably invented by the Egyptians, but popularized by the French about 1800. And so they are essentially just a wire. And have a head and a point. That's what you think of when you think of a nail. But these weren't the nails that were used for making furniture. These nails don't hold very well at all. They can be used in houses and they can be used for some things, but they're they just don't have the holding power. What has the holding power is what came really, I guess, after the Egyptians invented the wire nail, but we think it was invented by the Romans. And we call it sometimes a wrought head nail. So let's take a look at these nails. And these are all, the ones here you're seeing are handmade by a blacksmith. And they're iron. And what's different about them from the wire nails is that they're square instead of round. And they taper on all four sides. So they wedge into the wood, leaving a very strong joint behind. So this is what the Romans used. We found thousands of them in Roman campsites that have been dumped in wells and stuff. And people still make them today. Blacksmiths still make them today. And when I have a customer that will pay for it, I'm going to use these. But the customer is going to pay for it. These are going to be $1.50, sometimes up to $2 per nail. That's really expensive. So that's a great option if you have a nice historic piece and they hold very well. But the other option, modern option today, is to use what I call, these are machine forged nails. And these are made in France. So the French are forgiven for inventing wire nails if they invented these. And these are machine forged on a die. And they look very much like the Roman nails. They are square in section and they taper and they even have this nice little faceted head. And so they look pretty good. And this is what we're going to use for the bookcase. And these hold really well. Probably not as well as a Roman nail because the surface is smooth. And if you saw in the Roman nail, it was really kind of nasty and kind of rough. And that's a good thing. But we're going to use these because these are run about 5 cents a piece. So big price difference. And you can't really tell the difference unless you look really close or your customer's really savvy. So after Roman nails and these machine forged nails came in, one of the other big innovations in the late 18th century was what we call cut nails. And you're going to see cut nails a lot. So let's look at some cut nails. And cut nails are a machine-made nail. They're still made today. And they are different than the Roman nail. And the difference is that they taper in one direction, as you can see here, but when I turn it 90 degrees, they're not tapered. And that's because they are cut from a sheet of steel or iron, and the shear is at an angle. So they're sheared off at an angle, and that creates this taper, but the thickness of the plate is consistent. And so that's why we call it a cut nail. These hold really well. Maybe not as well as one of the blacksmith nails, but this is what built, America in houses and furniture all through the 19th century and early 20th century. They're still made today. They're still used in masonry. I still like them quite a lot. And they cost, 2-3 cents a piece. So you're going to be able to save a little bit of money there. So those are the three major, sort of broad categories of nails. But let's talk a little bit more about specifically, you're going to hear a lot of crazy nail names, like what's a brad, what's a clout, what's a rose head, what's a wrought head, what's a clinch nail. And in furniture, we basically have 3 or 4 types of nails that we use. There are hundreds of names for nails, but the most important thing is what do they do and how are they used in a project. So if we look here at this little board that's filled with nails, you can see some of the nails and how they look to the user. And the nails that we're going to use have this pronounced head. And so this head is used for fastening things on. So we're trying to fasten the side of the case onto the shelves or fasten the back on, and we don't want to be able to pull that off. So we have a head that acts like a washer, if you think about it as sort of a bolt with a washer. It's the same thing. So you want to use a headed nail. So here we have, this is one of the blacksmith nails. This is one of the wrought machine-made nails. This is a rosehead cut nail. So they look very similar. You can get the same kind of look. And this is a cut clinch nail. So any of these headed nails will work just fine. Now if we look down here on the second row, this square, this is a brad. And this nail doesn't have much of a head at all. So this is what it looks like when it's not in the wood. So as you can see, it doesn't really have a head at all. So it can't do the same sort of fastening that these nails do up here. It's more useful for toe nailing and just holding things on temporarily, while the glue dries, or for shear forces. But it's really just not as good for fastening. And then the last kind of nail is this little tiny freckle of a nail, and that's a cut headless brad, and I'll show you what those look like. And those are these things that look basically just like wire, and they're tapered a little bit, but these have virtually no holding power in the head whatsoever. So they're useful for tacking up molding on casework and holding it down while the glue does its job. These are very expensive, and truth be told, I use an 18 gauge or 23 gauge pinner instead of these because these can cost about 25 cents each, which is really just crazy for holding on molding. And then the last kind of nail we've got here, this is a wire sinker, and that's with a waffle head, which is just ugly as all heck. So don't use that, all right? Be conscientious with your furniture. So now that I've hopefully convinced you to try to give nails a try on your project, what you have to know is that it needs a pilot hole. Unlike wire nails don't need pilot holes. Cut nails and blacksmith-made nails need a pilot hole. So you need to do some experiments first off to determine what size pilot hole you should use to get this to go into the wood without it splitting. And so what I normally do is I try to find either a tapered bit or a straight bit that is, where the tip is about the same size as the tip here. That's a good place to start. And that'll give us some wedging action. because then this is all thicker, so it's going to wedge against the wood, but hopefully it will allow this center core of the nail to pass without splitting. It all depends on how splitty the wood is and where you are, how close to the end you are, but that's a good place to start. The other important thing that most people fail to do when they first start off with furniture-made nails is they make their pilot too deep. So they make their pilot the same depth as their nail, which is what you do with screws. But you don't do that with nails. You want the pilot hole to be only about 2/3 the length of the nail shaft. And that means the nail has to do some real work and really wedges that tip into the wood and pushes the fibers aside and is what gives the head its fastening power. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to figure out which pilot to use. I've got a pretty good idea because I've built this case before, but we're going to put in the pilot holes, and then we're going to put in some of these nails, and the case will be together. So the case was in clamps, and we left it overnight, which is great. I always prefer to do that just so the glue has as much time to set up as it needs to. And so we're going to reinforce the joints with nails. And the way that I do that is, the way that I lay out the nails has no measuring. I really don't like measuring because, addition and subtraction will get you into trouble every time. So I do almost all my layout either by eye, or if I have to have a bunch of nails that look very consistent, I'll use dividers. And so I have two pair of dividers here. One I've set for, I don't know, this is about 1.5 inches maybe, and that's going to be the first nail at the front and the last nail at the back. And so I want to cheat those a little bit toward the front here so that they'll have more fastening power there, which is where it's important. And then the second pair of dividers I'm going to use to step off the distance between for however many number of nails I want to put there. So if I step off this way, here's 1 nail, 2 nails, and then I end up here, then I'll have 4 nails all the way across the side, which is plenty fine. You can have 5 nails. I think that's what I had on that one. But if you're worried about spending too much money on nails, this is one way to conserve a little nail. So I'm going to prick in here. So now I've done my layout. And I have this piece of tape here for a good reason. And I'm marking on the tape where these nails are. And I'm going to move this tape every time that I need a row of nails. So instead of having to lay out every line, every shot line, I can just use the tape over and over again and move it. And also that way I don't have to put any pencil lines down, which I don't want to mark this surface any more than it has to be because it's really difficult to plane it after nails are in it. So here we have an egg beater drill, also what we call an egg beater drill now, but it's really a hand drill and works like an egg beater. And a bit that I've determined, I think this is 5/64, which is going to be about the right size for this nail. And so I'm just going to come in here. And remember, we're only going 2/3 of the way in. We don't want the pilot hole to be as deep as the nail is long. We want the nail to do some work. So, as you can see, this is not difficult to make these pilot holes at all. And so now comes the question of what length nail do we use? So I've got some nails here. And that's a really good historical question is how long should the nail be? And the answer is, of course, it depends on the wood and all that. But the quick answer is there's an old formula that the union carpenters would use. And what they would do is they would, if we come over here, and we can see how thick this top board is. So we're nailing through the side and into the shelf. So this top board is 1/2 inch thick because we took away 1/4 inch for the dado. So we've got 1/2 inch. So we convert that 1/2 inch, 1/2, into eighths. So 1/2 is 4/8, right? Yeah, that's the way the math works out for me. So we use a 4-penny nail. You take the numerator. And that's the simple equation. You don't have to remember anything about how even long a 4-penny nail is. You just grab the 4-penny nail. I'm going to nail these most of the way in and then take the tape off. And you can see they start going in very easily, and then as the taper engages and it hits the bottom of the pilot, it becomes more difficult to drive them home. So some of the other nailing rules that go into that equation is that if you are nailing into pine, then you probably should, if possible, go to 1 penny size larger. So you would go to a 5-penny nail. These are probably going to be just fine as 4-penny nails. You can kind of cheat and get away with a lot of those equations, but those are the common ones. You don't want to hit the wood with your hammer. That's a French mark, if you see those circular marks. I don't know what the French call them. Maybe American marks? All right. So, as you can see, this is all it takes, and moving the tape avoids a lot of layout chores. So, we'll finish by making the pilot holes here. We're going to do the other side, and then when we come back, we're going to be cutting the grooves for the back rail that's going to hold the backboards. So I'm going to sink these nails, and then we'll move on to the rest of them. So now we're going to lay in a short groove here, 4-inch long groove that is 1/4 inch deep, that's going to house this top rail. So this is the top rail of the bookcase. And like I said, you can do this before assembly, you can do it obviously after assembly, it doesn't really matter. What you don't want to do though, is you don't want to really measure anything, because measuring is how you're going to mess things up. So when I try to do a layout that has to be precise, instead of using numbers, I use the actual pieces. So the first thing is, I really don't know exactly how long how wide this is, and so I don't know how long the groove is, but I don't really care. So I'm just going to set my combination square to that length, whatever that length is, and then draw a little line there. So we know that the groove has to be the same length as this width. We know that we want to set the groove in the depth of the back. So the backboards have to go behind this thing. So we're going to take a gauge and we're going to set it to the thickness of the back. Very simple. Whatever that thickness is, it's about 1/2 inch, but it's nothing. You know, it's not going to be exact. So that gauge is set. So I come down here and I transfer that here, and I can pull that down a little bit there. So now we know where that groove needs to start. And then, to set the front wall of the groove, I know that the groove has to be offset by not only the back, but also the front wall has got to be in front of the top rail. So then we set this gauge for both. So that's set where that needs to be, and now I can just lay that in. So having multiple gauges, very common thing in handwork, is having several gauges so that you can leave them set. So I'm going to leave these set so they can be transferred to the other side of the case when I do the other groove. Very simple way to work. Much less likely to make a mistake. And then I have one gauge that's set for the depth. And so I grabbed this depth from one of the dados back there. And so we'll just use that to set the depth of the groove. All right. And then just in case you're blind as a bat like I am, I'm going to lay in some pencil lines there. And now comes the fun part. We get to chisel it out. So I'm going to start here near the back, but I'm not going to go all the way to that line because the chisel will tend to drift back as I chop. And so I want to save that cut for the last. And you see how the back of the chisel is forcing this chip up? That's intentional. If I turned the chisel around with the bevel facing the waste, it wouldn't do that, and then I'd have a lot more work to do. The other trick with malleting is you don't want to get woodworker's elbow or tennis elbow. And so my advice is the same as I got from a drummer friend of mine, and that is you don't clench the handle on the point of impact. It is right before you hit the chisel, you relax your grip, and that way the vibration from the impact won't transmit right up your elbow, and you won't get as tired or injured. So this is much like mortising. So you're getting sort of a mini mortise lesson here. Except this is only going to be 1/4 inch deep, not 1 1/4 inch, which is typical cabinet work. Sort of see how deep I'm going. I'm almost going the whole depth. One of the beautiful things about pine. Now I come to this point, I don't want to really splinter this end out because you can see this. So I'm going to chop this up a little bit with the grain first. Just take my time here and make sure this wall is as clean as possible, because that's what people see and that's what your friends will judge you by. And this should just look a lot like the dadoing that we did, except for you're working along the grain instead of across the grain. So now that I've cleaned out most of that waste, I can come in here and sneak up to my final line without any danger of crossing over. All right. So I just need to clean up these walls a little bit here with my chisel, and then we'll get in there with the router plane and clean out the bottom. And it's still set for 1/4 inch, which was what we used to clean out the dados. So this should be a fairly easy operation. Okay, we've got the groove mostly chiseled in, so I have the router plane here, which is set still to the 1/4 inch depth of the dado. And you just get in there, and it just peels right out. Now, just like with the dado, I'm using the side of the iron to clean the wall as well as the floor. There's some fur there, but nothing too bad. Nothing I can't get out with a chisel. There we go. The corner of the router plane didn't want to get that. A little bit of fur on this side wall too. So I've got to do this to the other side of the cabinet, to the other upright. And then we can put the top rail in and the kick, nail those in place, and we'll be ready to move on into assembling the whole case with the back. So just finishing up the top rail, and we're going to put this in. I can see that I've got my triangle here, which is on the top edge, so I know that this goes in like this, and hopefully just slides down like that. So this can get glued and nailed, and then when we come back, we'll have the kick all ready to put down below the lowest shelf. And we're almost there. We're going to fit the kick now, and the kick is glued to the underside of the bottom shelf, which will greatly strengthen this, and that's a good thing because the heavy books go on the bottom shelf, and will also help prevent the case from racking left to right. So the kick does a lot of work. So we want to make sure that the joinery is really nice and tight. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to, after we get it fit in there, is we're going to glue this to the underside, and that's a long grain to long grain joint, super strong. And then we're going to nail it in through either end with two of those machine forged nails. So the first thing we have to do is get that kick in its hole. And I think it's too long. It was when we checked it before. And it is indeed too long by about 1/16 of an inch. So that is not something you can saw away very easily without making a mistake, but it is really easy to shoot away with a shooting board. So I'm going to get in here with a knife and just mark where that is. So now I can see exactly where that is. And I'm going to, if you remember, we were beveling off this outfeed corner when we first shot the sides to length. So we need to do that here so it doesn't spelch. And now with that protected, we can come up here and we just need to shoot away the bevel. So I've got my triangle here so I know which way things go. I really want it nice and tight, but I still think I'm bowing out the sides just a little bit. Yeah, I'm bowing out the side a little bit here, so I really need to shoot that just one more time. So what I'm going to do, instead of shooting this end, which we already shot, is I'm going to shoot the other end, and that will just help ensure that it's square. And I'm going to show you a really quick way to bevel that corner without having to use a chisel. So what you do is you put the piece against your shooting board, against the fence, and put it in a really acute angle, and just give it 3 or 4 strokes, and you've created a little bevel there. And so that's the quick way of doing that. So let's try it again. Okay, that's much better. That'll slide right in, and it's nice and tight. So I'm going to set this back 1/4 inch from the front just to give it a shadow line. You can put it flush if you like. Totally your choice. So once again, got hide glue in the house. And it's a little warmer in here today, so I didn't have to put it in the warm water first. And this is what it normally looks like, when the room's about 70 degrees. Looks just like PVA as far as runniness goes. So we're going to slide it in there. I've got a line marked 1/4 inch in from that front edge of the bottom shelf. Press it in place. And then we'll bring in one of these clamps here. And then make small adjustments. Good. Now this is one area of the project where I definitely recommend you clamping this up and getting a nice good joint there, because like I said, this is a lot of strength in the cabinet. It doesn't look like much, but it does a lot of work. Always fussy parallel jaw clamps. Okay, tighten those up. We've got a little squeeze out that I'm going to clean up here with a toothbrush, and then we're going to come and drive in some nails there so that this is nice and strong. Nailing the kick-in is just like nailing in the shelves. I've got a line of tape here that I marked off with some marks as to where I want to put my nails, and so that I can easily transfer that layout to the other side. And I've got my little hand drill here, putting in the pilots. And then we drive the nails in. Do the other side, and then we're ready to put the back on and square the case up. Well, it's getting exciting now. It's starting to look like a bookcase, to me at least. So I've got the backboards kind of laid in here just to make sure that everything lines up, which it does, and everything's kind of flat. It is. But I need to see if the case is square or not. So there are lots of ways to do it. Usually a tri-square is not the best way. Usually the best way is to measure across the diagonals. So here I'm going to measure from the center of that tape, the center point, to here. And I've got 58 7/16, and then do exactly the same thing on the other diagonal. And I've got 58 7/16. So this case is square, which is great for me, but it doesn't show you how to get it square. And the answer is fairly simple. So we made those two measurements. Say that this one was 58, and this one was 58 1/4 from these two corners. So this corner, pretend, was the long dimension. We take a bar clamp, probably a pipe clamp, and compress that long dimension until, when you measured them both, they'd probably be 58 1/8. And that is when it is square. And so you hold the case square while we do the next operation, which is to fit the backboards. So it's very simple. Just pull the long dimension so that it matches the other dimension, and your case is square when you put these in. So here's the last tongue and groove backboard, and we'll put it in here and fit it in to its tongue. And it's a little tight, which is good. And so we'll knock this guy in a little bit before we fit the whole thing. All right. And I can see that we are about a 1/16, a fat 1/16 too wide. Also a good thing. So what I'm going to do is, just like when we were shooting the ends of the kick, we're going to shoot the edge of this back, and I'm going to make a little mark as to what I'm going to remove. Just do this in pencil. I'm probably actually going to overshoot that mark a little bit because I want to allow for some expansion in these panels. We're shooting this during the winter, and so the humidity is really low, and so everything is shrunk. And so in the summer, when the humidity goes up, these back panels will expand a little bit. So if we don't allow a little bit of space between these tongue and groove joints, they could split out the sides or cause some bad buckling. So always got to accommodate a little bit of wood movement. So let's take this guy out, hopefully without breaking the tongue. And take it over to the face vise. And this is something I do with a jack plane. Jack plane is a pretty coarse tool and has a curved iron on it. And so we have about a 10-inch radius on this. And that radius acts sort of like a gouge and allows this to take a really, really thick shaving if we like. And I do want it to take a thick shaving. So I'm just going to extend the iron out here, make sure it's centered in the mouth of the tool. Okay, I can see my line. I'm not worried about tear out or anything at this point, but you can take a massive shaving with this if you need to. This is only about, this is a wimpy shaving for a jack plane, so you can really hog off the material. I've overshot my line now. The line has disappeared, so I'm just going to take 3 more strokes. So that goes in, which is great. And I've got a little bit of a gap here, which is great. And that's the gap that I can use to space out the boards. And so the next thing we're going to do is we're going to glue these long backboards into the long grain edges of the sides and then nail everything in through the shelves to really strengthen this case up. And then we'll get on to cleaning up. So we're going to glue these backboards into the case. We don't have a rabbet. Sometimes you cut a rabbet in the backside of the sides and nail it in. But to make things simple, I didn't design a rabbet into this. So we're going to put a glue here and clamp it up and then nail it in. We're going to do that on both of these edges. And then we'll slide the final 2 panels in and nail everything down. Gluing this joint is a really good idea just because it will add even more strength. Once we put the glue line in and once we triangulate things with the nails, this thing's not going to go anywhere. So once again, hide glue, hide glue, hide glue. And we'll put a thin bead on it. You also notice that I've glued scrap here to the side of the case, and that's when I clamp it up, I won't dent the case because as of now, we can't do anything about cleaning up the case except maybe using a little sandpaper, so we want to be very careful about not damaging that case. Trying to get it all flush up here so I have less work to do flushing everything up at the end. And you'll also notice I seem to be, it's like I'm sponsored by moving blankets and blue tape. I use moving blankets all the time in my shop. I found that they save me a whole day of cleanup with a complicated project because there's no, shop rash, as Jeff Miller calls it, all over your projects. Really, really saves you some time. Good. Do the same thing on the other edge. So with the case all glued up here, we're going to let this glue sit up for an hour or something, get some lunch, answer some emails or something, and then we'll slide those in, nail it together, and it'll hold books. So now we're going to put the nails in through the backboards into the shelves, and this will help keep everything nice and sturdy. So this should all look very familiar. You can use 4-penny nails for this operation because the back is also 1/2 inch, just like nailing through the sides. And you can see I'm using the same tape, a little bit of tape there to put the nails in where they need to go. Yeah. Tore a little bit, got that under the head, but I recovered. Yay. Okay. Just don't want to throw any tape away. Not that woodworkers are cheap or anything. Right. So now we need to get those last 2 backboards slid into here. And you probably were thinking to yourself, those aren't going to slide in. And the answer is right now they wouldn't slide in. But we're going to tweak them with a shoulder plane. We're going to tweak these tongues so they will slide right in. Then we'll be able to adjust them to account for the wood movement over the seasons. So that's what we'll do next. I'm going to trim up this tongue with the shoulder plane here. You don't have to have a shoulder plane to do this operation. Any rabbiting plane, any kind, will do this operation. And so we're just going to take it and run it along here. A stroke, maybe 2, until it just goes in really easy. I could use 1 more stroke. A little tight down here, but the top is going in really nicely. Nice and smooth. And so now I'm going to trim this tongue in the same way and trim the tongue on the other one, and then we'll slide those in. If you can trim both sides of the tongue, you might as well. So we'll do this guy too. So I think they're making bets back there that this won't work, that it won't go together. So we'll see. Oh no, that won't work. So that's how we do it, and now we're gonna nail these down, and we'll be able to clean things up and get it ready for paint. So now I'm fastening in these last 2 shelves, and you'll notice I have a small gap between each of these boards. As I mentioned, this is winter time, And so things are really shrunk, so I want to allow for some expansion in the humid summer days. You don't have to leave a lot with pine. Pine actually doesn't move that much once it's dry. So I'm leaving a little less than a 1/16, and that should be totally fine over these 1, 2, 3 joints. So assembly is complete, and now we just have to do some cleanup. And I'm going to be leveling the joints all along the tops and the front edges, bringing it up to a nice level of finish, and then we can start mixing up the paint. So we're going to apply milk paint to the outside of the long uprights, and I like the contemporary look that it'll be like a wash more than a paint. So we'll be able to see the grain through it, give it a very nice contemporary look. I like to use milk paint because I've sucked enough volatile organic compounds in my life. And so I like to use things that are as natural as possible so I'm not turning green in the night. And milk paint, you can make it yourself from lime and milk and vinegar and pigment, or you can buy it. There are a couple companies that make powder that you can mix, and it uses a dried milk. And so the first thing you want to do is you want to get a mason jar and fill it up about halfway full of water. And then you want to get the instructions out, and then you want to throw them away because you don't follow them. It'll make milk paint that's way, way too thick. You want to make a much more watery milk paint. So they would normally tell you to fill this entire mason jar with water and then dump the entire contents of the bag into it. And I say double the amount of water. Double the amount of water that they tell you to use, and you'll make a very nice paint. So this one, I've been working on this bag for a while. And so I'm not even putting I'm putting about a fourth or a little bit less of a bag in there. And then you put the lid on it and you shake it up. So we're going to shake it up here for the next 30 minutes or so. I'm going to be leveling the case or doing other work in the shop or whatever, and just coming over here and shaking it up to make sure that the powder's dissolved. And after about 30 minutes, then we're going to strain out the chunks and we'll be ready to go. So when I'm leveling the front edges to the shelves, I usually use a really freshly sharpened block plane, and I skew it so that when I run over that cross grain from the shelves, it's not going to tear it out like it normally would if I were coming straight on. So I'm coming at about a 30-degree angle at least, and that produces much less of that fuzzy, woolly feathering that you get. You might get a little bit, but you can then try to clean that up with some strokes going this way. And it's just working back and forth on all the shelves and the front edges of the sides until everything looks nice. You can also get out a sanding block and dress them all this way if you like. So I've got a little more work here. And then I just need to clean up this top edge a little bit, level the top rail to the top of the backboards, and we're got some paint cooking, and so we're almost to paint. So about 30 minutes later, we're going to strain our milk paint. Just got some cheesecloth. You can get this at the grocery store or any decent paint store. Used for straining whatever. Just put that across the mouth and get all the nasty chunks out. Now you can see this is really thin, and that's good. It's supposed to be like that. It's supposed to be more like a colored water than like a thick-bodied latex or oil-based paint. It has very little body, and as a result it dries really quickly too. So you can usually deal with the paint, put a top coat on it if you want after 30 minutes or something. So I'll put this guy aside. And I like to roll on the paint. So I just use these inexpensive sponge rollers, and you can usually get about 10 or 12 uses out of them before you have to buy another pack for $2. So you can see this is really thin, and that's a good thing. It's exactly what I want. So we start near the ends to build up some color, and then just feather it, just like you're painting a wall, out to the edge so you don't get any big glops on the edges that'll drip over. You can see I've also put tape on the front edges and the top edge and the back edge back here by the back to protect it from the paint. But even if I get paint on the edge, really doesn't matter because I'm going to come back and I'm going to clean it off with a plane. And that'll give me a nice crisp edge, crisper than tape can give you. So I do want to protect it, but I'm not going to worry about it. So. Don't worry about the bubbles. They'll all pop. It's just water bubbles from turbulence. It's either that or a small gnome or fairy that lives inside the milk paint. But we don't really know which one it is. Okay, now I'm going to move this carefully down here. And I'm probably just going to use one coat. The other case back behind me has 2 coats, and it started obscuring the grain more than I liked. And so I've been experimenting with this mixture with twice the water as usual, and using one coat, and I've been very happy with the way it looks. So that's probably how we're going to end up here. All right. So once you get all the color on, I usually roll down it once all the way, just to make sure there's no big puddles that need to either be spread out or absorbed. Make sure I didn't miss any spots. And then the last thing I do is I take a traditional paintbrush and I'll tip it off. So this is what's called tipping off, which is where you just, it's kind of like using a card scraper. You come in at just almost 90 degrees and just spread out a last even coat. And if there are any bits of dried paint in the mixture, this tipping off seems to get rid of them. Also quickly pops all those bubbles. All right. So it's already starting to dry here along the edges, so probably in about 30 minutes we'll be able to flip this over and we'll be able to do the other side. And we're almost there to putting on the final coat of varnish. We've got just a couple little details to clean up before we put the varnish on. And one of them is that a little bit of the paint seeped under the tape here. So we just need to clean that up. And a block plane does a good job of that. So trying not to spelch out here because that would be bad. So there's just a little bit of paint there. Kind of hard to tell, kind of hard to see. I'm sure the customer won't notice it, but I will. So that looks pretty good. The last thing to do is make sure that if you've made any sharp edges to break them again with a little bit of sandpaper, or you can even use a burnisher for sharpening a scraper. And the final step before putting on the film finish is I get a brown paper sack from the liquor store and use that to knock down any of the nubs that are left off over from the water that raised the grain on the sides. And so I don't know what grit liquor paper bags are, you know, it's 11 billion or whatever, but it's the same silica that's in the wood. So it just knocks it down without taking a lot of pigment off, and leaves a nice smooth surface for the varnish to go on. Be sure to get down like that. It might take a little bit of the pigment off of the nails, but that's not a big deal. And so just as soon as I get these knocked down, we'll put this up on the horses and we'll talk about the film finish that we're going to put on this, which is a homemade mixture. Very easy and inexpensive for you to make at home. The last thing to do with this is to put on some sort of clear protective finish. The paint, this really isn't much protection at all, and there's no finish on the interior at this point. You can go with just about anything. You can go with shellac, you can go with a lacquer. I like to use a homemade blend of finishing materials that you can pick up at any home center. It makes a nice kind of raggable on finish, and it's equal parts spar varnish, which you can find, you know, it's just some sort of spar urethane. So it's 1/3 spar urethane, 1/3 mineral spirits, and 1/3 boiled linseed oil. So the boiled linseed oil gives it a little bit of yellow color. The spar varnish has the binder in it that sort of protects it from spills. And the mineral spirits make it so you can rag it on, thins it down. It's all you need. You can, much cheaper than buying some sort of fancy Danish oil or teak oil or squeezed gnome oil or whatever they sell. And you can make all you want, whenever you want. And if you want it thinner than this, you can just add mineral spirits, paint thinner, whatever. And if you want it thicker, you can add more linseed oil. And it's real easy. Put on thin coats, and then wipe off the excess between coats. And it might take maybe 3 coats of this to, you know, for a bookshelf. For a more hard-wearing surface, you might want, you know, 4 or 5. Just quit when it looks like you want it to look, or you're really bored applying the finish. So we can see that the varnish and the oil are bringing up the color nicely on this, but we can still see the grain, which I'm happy about. And if you didn't want to go the contemporary route and put this paint on it, it doesn't matter. This goes on over everything. You can put it on over bare wood, you can put it on over oil, you can put it on over just about anything. So it sticks to anything and protects anything. So. I'm probably not going to put any of this mixture on the back of the back. I'll put it on the inside of the back that faces the user, but it's not really going to affect the expansion or contraction of the wood. I mean, there's no finish really that can stop moisture exchange, so I'm not going to waste any finish back there. So you can see that I've kind of taken a dry part of the rag and removed most of the excess, so I've got a nice thin coat on there. So carefully walk this down onto the horses. And now we can just apply it to the bare wood. If you want a really more contemporary look than this, I would suggest using a water-based finish. Water-based finishes don't have this yellowing color. I like the yellowing color. This pine is gonna yellow up no matter what you do. But if you want to preserve sort of that clean look without any yellowing, as long as you want, water-based finishes have almost no yellowing components to them. So that would be my choice. Also, water-based finishes don't smell as much as this stuff does. You can reduce the smell a bit by using low odor or odorless mineral spirits, but they don't really have no odor. But you can't get rid of all the smell, but most of it you can. So I'm just going to continue putting on this finish, and after the finish dries, we'll take some sandpaper and level any nubs that are left over from grain getting raised or little torn grain, and after that, we're ready to put some books on it. So there you have it. Only took us a couple days of shop time and some home center pine, and we built this, this bookcase entirely from scratch and entirely by hand with hand tools. Very simple project. You can build as many of these as you need for however many books or tchotchkes or Hummel figurines you have. I hope you've enjoyed the process, and I hope that you are empowered to make more of your own stuff instead of buying the chipboard junk that's just going to end up at the curb anyway, because this bookcase, unlike that chipboard stuff, is going to look better with every scratch and ding and kick and scrape. And that, as far as I'm concerned, is worth going to the extra effort for.